Like once you get by a million, I think it's going to be hard to slow it down. Like I think it's then all at once type thing.
10 trillion plus is next as far as the new number of monetary units. And you think that within 3 years, we're probably looking at bubble here in 2000. We can see that. And then later on, the great financial crisis where it goes down.
You could see like deep deflationary forces in 2024. Like you could see their CPI prints go deeply
Years,
negative
which would be 2035. Do you think that that is accurate? Do you think
based on some of the things that I just laid out. I think we're getting closer to it than further away from it. So is everybody else. Like
Mhm.
they just don't know it yet. But hyperinflation is happening.
Here? Thank you for joining me, Preston. This is a thrill. I was just thinking before we started about how I've listened to you for so many hours, and then obviously we hung out in person before, but it's kind of strange being on this end of the interview and like interviewing someone I'm used to hearing as the interviewer. So, yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, no, I've always enjoyed our interactions, especially in person.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's see. We first met in Miami at the Bitcoin conference in 2023, and then the even more fun time was in Telluride. We were what was that? 4 days? It was like 3, 4 days.
Yeah.
We were in Telluride. There were what a couple dozen of us. It was you, Jeff, others, and anyway, I really enjoyed that because it's always fun when. One of my favorite compliments I always get is when someone says, "Luke, you're the same in real life as you are online." Because and it's the same with you, on that trip, and Jeff Booth and others. It's just so much fun to hang out with you guys, and you're like, obviously there are some differences, and we could talk about other stuff that we don't typically talk about online. But it's funny when the personality is the same and you're actually getting to know the person. So
Because
anyway,
sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's very different than what you expect. Yes. Yes.
yeah, yeah. Um, okay, so let's see, where do we start? Okay, so on that trip, speaking of that, another thing that I found that I thought was very funny was on the flight out there, we ran into each other on the plane, and then like the first, I think it was like four people we met were all engineers, right? So you're an aerospace engineer, you have that background. I think it was next we met like a chemical energy engineer. Then I think we met mechanical engineer. There was some other one. I think there was a civil engineer in there somewhere. Like I was like, are we at a Bitcoin event or are we at an engineering event? Like I was surrounded by all these
Yeah.
engineers, yourself included. And so I guess starting there, why do you think so many engineers gravitate to Bitcoin? Obviously you have your experience. I don't know if you want to talk about your personal experience coming to Bitcoin, but why do you think that so many engineering minds make it here?
I think this one's really obvious. So engineers inherently have to first define a problem, and then their whole purpose is to engineer and design a solution to the said problem. So it's interesting to me. Like Greg Foss is another great example of a guy
Yeah.
who spent his entire career in finance, but his original study is engineering. I think he's a civil guy. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me like Michael Saylor and many Lynn Alden, many others that have kind of like had a toe in finance, but also had a grounding in engineering principles early on in their life, whether they were practicing or not. And so like if you're going to engineer a dam or you're going to engineer an aircraft or you're going to engineer something that's going to be shot into space, like the whole thing is just overcoming massive amounts of problems that stand between you and kind of accomplishing what it is that you're setting out to achieve. And another thing about engineers is like they have they very clearly define what that destination is. And so I think the reason you have so many financial people that have these engineering backgrounds is they're saying, okay, there's this massive obstacle. It's called the fiat system. I can see it's a massive problem and major problem that seems to be spiraling like an uncontrolled detonation that's occurring. And like at your root, there's always a way to kind of engineer a solution. Like there's always like this will resolve itself somehow, some way. It's just like how is it going to resolve itself? And so when you define that and you're looking at the world through this lens that there will be a solution and that there will be a favorable outcome at some point, you start to think about, okay, so like what currently exists, what is my environmental setting? Like that's a key thing for engineering. Like you can't possibly design a solution to something unless you clearly define what that operating environment will look like. So like if I'm going to define a Mars rover, I have to clearly define my environment at on Earth through the takeoff sequence. Then what's my environment in space in transit? Then what's my environment as like entering that atmosphere and coming under that gravitational pull? And then what's it like on the ground of Mars in order to continue to sustain operations as a space vehicle in that setting? Like if I don't clearly define each one of those phases, understand what type of material solution I need, what type of pressures are going. I apologize, I can't figure out how to turn the thing off.
Like the video, I guess.
Yeah, like as an engineer, I need to figure out how to solve that problem. But you really have to have a firm understanding of your environment, your constraints of those environments in order to design a solution. But that's like the thing is like you are solving the problem. One of my biggest frustrations in finance in general is you can go sit on so many panels with these gigabrain people that have spent 40 years in finance. And the whole time that they're on these panels, they'll sit around and talk for an hour or 2 hours. The whole time they're there, the only thing they're talking about is problem definition the whole time. They're not talking about how you actually solve the problem. And and if they would even broach that subject, it gets very political. They talk about policies. They talk about how like more of the same of the fundamental issue, the problem that they just spent hours defining is the solution somehow. And it's borderline comical to me as an engineer to watch that, because it's like, there's no shortage in the world of problem identifiers, but there is a massive shortage of problem solvers. And there's a big difference. And so that's, I guess, my roundabout way of saying it. It's no surprise to me that engineers are the ones that are free. And they don't even have to be software engineers. Just engineers in general are the ones that are kind of seeing Bitcoin for what it is.
And do you think that Bitcoin as a whole, the network, is full of those problem solvers? Because to me, when I look at it, I love what you just said, abundance of problem identifiers, shortage of problem solvers. I look at the Bitcoiners and I think there's a fundamental difference there. And I think the outside world doesn't see that. They see the Bitcoiners as also the problem identifiers, like, oh, fiat currency and politics and this and that, the other. So for those that are maybe new to Bitcoin or trying to understand what makes Bitcoin the Bitcoiners the problem solvers and not the problem identifiers, what do you think is that fundamental difference there?
Well, I mean, they've engineered a solution. Now, I haven't written a line of code, but I can recognize a solution when I see it. And so, yeah, there's a ton of participants that are, long-term holders. There's people that are speculators. And I would argue, you don't find a lot of them that are engineers, at least not ones that have any type of financial background. So you will find engineers that are speculating in the space by owning some of these various coins. But what I think they miss is they don't even understand the problem that they're necessarily solving. I think they're fringe, they're engineers that are designing applications and designing odd end things that kind of like fit onto this much broader thing that everybody says blockchain and whatnot. And so they're engineers, but they're designing engineering solutions for going back to our Mars lander, right? Like maybe they're designing the wheels for the Mars lander, but they don't even understand why it's going to Mars. Like they are designing like applications that are tangential to this bigger, broader problem and mission that's being solved for. And that's actually very common to see a lot of engineers on the fringe and maybe kind of a little bit distracted as to what I think the much bigger elephant in the room is. Does that, I don't know if that scratches the itch to answer the question, because I kind of went a little bit off on a tangent with
No,
it.
no. I think that's right. So, you think engineers are drawn to Bitcoin because they're trying to solve the problem, and then you think that Bitcoiners as a whole are, those problem solvers, and that perhaps even too much problem solvers, like over engineering, right? It sounds like that's what you're talking about at the end there. So with that said, why do you think Bitcoin is that solution? Like, if you're going to try to explain to somebody what that problem is, like someone might be hearing you and saying, like, okay, what's the problem he's referring to? What do you think is the essence engineering problem that we have today? And why do you think Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone and not some over engineered thing is the specific solution to that? Why is it
Yeah.
the Mars
So,
rover?
so uh Saylor does such a great job talking this specific point. He equates the existing fiat system to like bloodletting in medicine. And so like your body's a closed loop. The energy inside of your body is like you put food in it, your body can take in the air, it can take the food, and it turns that into energy, and it's this closed loop system. It's very efficient in how it acts. But the existing financial system, the fiat system, through the debasement of the currency, is effectively like if you had a human being and you would go up to that person and you would take a bag of blood out of their body every hour. Okay, so you're like extracting way more. So like how would your body naturally react to this? Well, your body would start generating tons of mitochondria in the cells to offset the energy. The person would have to eat a whole lot more. They'd have to breathe a lot stronger. But that would be the body's reaction to this bloodletting. The problem that even that example doesn't like, let's say that, so using that example further, so like you're extracting value, you're extracting energy out of the body. And so like as you do this, in order for this fiat system to keep perpetuating itself in the way that it is, the bloodletting would have to increase and get stronger and stronger and stronger until you get to a point where the person can't eat enough, the person can't breathe enough to create enough energy for the amount of blood and energy that's being sucked out of the body itself. Okay. And that's kind of where we're at with this financial system right now is they are doing so much debasement to the tune of, I think the next round is going to be in the tens of trillions, that you get to a catastrophic failure condition that something has to manifest itself and replace it. So what Bitcoin is it's the thing that stops the bloodletting out of the body and prevents the fiat system from continuing to expand. Jeff Booth talks about like how the exponential piece of debasement in fiat currency growth is creating deflationary forces in finance. But to mask all that, they have to continue to do more and more printing, which would be the equivalent of more and more bloodletting, going back to like the Michael Saylor example. So like that's the problem. There's no peg to money anymore, or there hasn't been for a while, but it's finally manifested itself through decades of this, that you're getting to an end game with it. And we could get
Yeah,
into all the nuances of that, but like in very general terms, for somebody who's not intimately familiar with finance, that's a visual way for people to maybe think about like what's actually playing out on a very global scale.
I think a drug addiction is another good metaphor too. That's perhaps not as good of a metaphor, I think, but I think it's the same idea that, as the quality of the blood goes down from the bloodletting, then the bloodletting amount has to increase because the blood's not worth as much. Or like with political currency, as the value of that currency goes down, you got to increase it. Or with drugs, as you have that new standard, you have to increase, right?
Let me give you another example that kind of plays on the body. So like the way the body's going to offset it, this bloodletting, is more mitochondria, more heavier breathing. Your lungs are going to have to get larger, like all the things to just sustain basic bodily functions, right, is going to be what it optimizes for because of all the bloodletting. But what is getting compromised is efficiency. your body is not going to be operating in the most efficient and optimal manner. So like blood that's going to your brain is going to be suppressed. Like things that aren't things that are auxiliary type luxuries of like what you can do as a human are going to be minimized, and energy production is going to be the primary focus of what happens if this bloodletting continues to take place at a certain pace, and it's done gradually in a way that the body can kind of slowly handle it. So when we think about how the economy functions today and like what is optimized for, isn't it fascinating that the United States, with this massive GDP, if you look at the financialization industry, like banking in general, it dominates the GDP in the United States, dominates it. When it could actually be quite a very simple and elegant solution like Bitcoin. But because of the bloodletting that's been happening for decades, this has turned into this massive, massive interest and incentive for that global body to focus in on this idea of finance and creating financial products and all these people and all the bankers and like all of it. It's crazy. If you keep pulling on this idea of like when you have bloodletting, what is optimized for, you can see like why. Here's an interesting point, right? Because this is all energy we're talking about inside of a body. Isn't it interesting that all the big major banks, the BlackRocks, the Fidelities, or not necessarily Fidelity is one of the better ones, but the JP Morgans and all them, how they're in this battle with energy companies? Isn't that fascinating? Right? So like going back to our body example, and we're talking about energy consumption, they want to be able to point the finger and say, well, no, it's this organ over here that's causing all of the consumption of the energy that we're producing with all this mitochondria in the body, right? And all this heavy breathing that we're doing, when in fact it's the bloodletting that's causing this to occur, right? So you can see it playing out in just the everyday, like when we just look around at like how the economy, the global economy is constructed. You have these certain organizations that are at each other's throats, and they're saying, oh, it's the environment, it's this, it's that, the reason why we're struggling with energy independence and the optimization of like how energy is spent, whether that's battery technology and like all these other things. So yeah, just a little bit more context of like that example.
Yeah, definitely. It's the Mars rover blaming Mars for its problems. Right.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah. So, okay, if debasement and printing money is the bloodletting, and like you were saying, it's taken many decades to compound slowly through the 70s and 80s and 90s, and and now it's ramping up faster and faster. You said 10 trillion a little while ago, that you think the next round of bloodletting, the next round of debasements in the tens of trillions. Why do you think that?
So when we look at COVID and you look at the amount of stimulus that went into the global economy, we were, oh, good Lord, you might even have to help me on the number, but we were in excess of $5 trillion globally. The amount of printed, newly created units that had to be inserted into the system. Now, people will hear that and they'll say, well, yeah, we had a global pandemic. Nobody was working. We had to do all these things. And that is true. But when you look at the sheer size of like how much, like you go back to the 2008, 2009 crisis, and you look at how much Fiat debasement or M2 had to be added into the system through that period of time, why did they have to add that in? Why did they have to keep adding these units? And when you look at the M2 chart, it just keeps going up in an exponential curve. If you look at it in log terms, it's this nice straight line. Why is that? Well, it's this idea of impairment. So because the entire system is credit based, meaning it's IOU based. Like if you and I create a promise with each other, we just created money. And if you say you're going to pay me back $10, I can now take that IOU that you have with me for $10 and I can go sell that IOU to somebody else and maybe get $9 from them. And then that's another IOU that's creating more money into the system. Meanwhile, the Fed hasn't done anything. Like we're creating these promises between each other without even the central bank's involvement, right? So that idea of credit creation being the foundation of double entry bookkeeping and being assets on one person's balance sheet and a liability on another, at the core of all of these promises, these IOUs between parties, is the central bank. And that central bank is adjusting the quantity of these IOUs through the foundation of money, the monetary baseline, and how they interact like a Fed controlled bank and how that bank interacts with the Fed. At that root level is this multiplier effect that they're controlling how many of these IOUs can be constructed and built, but not perfectly, right? So if you asked me, Preston, how many fiat monetary units are in the system? I have no clue, and neither do they. Okay, because it's a function of many different parties that are creating agreements in the flow of these. Now they have a general idea of like what they would say that number might be, and it really comes down to, do you consider an IOU between you and me as money? It doesn't matter whether you do or don't, because it trades like money and it performs like money, because I can take that and I can use it. So as long as these promises between you and me and everybody else don't dry up, they continue to perform as if they're real money. And what happens at a certain point, when you expand these promises so far, they get super saturated. Once you expand them so far, then they start to collapse, because let's say you owed me $10 and you lost your job and you can't pay me the $10 back. So now you come to me and you're saying, Preston, you're just going to have to wait another month. I don't have the money. Well, then I have that obligation with that other person to get that I owe them back their $9, because I was trading the promise that I had between you and me. And I had to go back to that person and say, it's going to be 3 months. Like I don't have it because this other guy owed me some money. And what this is this idea of what I'm describing here is cascading impairment of promises of credit. And so this, on a very grand scale, on a global scale, you have the like breathing, okay? You breathe in, you breathe out. Everything on the planet is a cycle. It goes through a cycle, and credit is no different. The expansion of credit and then the collapse of that credit through impairment. And then once it collapses so far and you get some creative destruction that reorganizes the value of things, and most importantly, the central banks step in and replenish these monetary units into the system after they think a little bit of creative destruction has occurred, then you get the expansion again. Okay. The problem with this system, because the person would hear that and be like, okay, well, they can just keep replenishing the units. You get some creative destruction and everything just kind of goes along normally without any issues. The problem is, let's go back to our bloodletting example, and I'll just describe this kind of like through a metaphor. When that collapse happens through impairment, if we were bloodletting at 1 bag a day, okay, once that collapse happens and then they replenish it with more monetary units, it's like now you got 2 bloodlettings a day. Okay. Then the collapse occurs through impairment, and then they replenish with more fiat units that they make up, and they put it into the system and it expands and everybody's happy again. But now it's 3 bloodlettings a day. Okay. And so what you have is what appears to be stability through the manipulation of the market by creating more fiat units into the system and more monetary and expanding credit. What you're doing over time is you're slowly making the entire system completely unstable to a collapse type scenario. So in the short cycles. It seems like you're like, oh, they've got it under control. If we didn't have the Fed, we would have no stability and everything would fall apart, right? No, if you had actual saleable monetary units, if gold was actually saleable, you would be in a completely different situation than what we're at. But because gold isn't saleable, that's what leads us to this ongoing where we had a gold standard, we come off the gold standard, we're now on a fiat standard, it's backed by oil, and then all of a sudden that one fails. It's because we have not, throughout history, since human history has evolved, we've never had a saleable monetary unit, especially in digital form, that was easily sent between parties. And if you have something like that, you can allow creative destruction to occur and everything's going to get repriced. And then the people who were responsible when others were borrowing are the ones that then own those assets, and everything resets itself because there's a fundamental level of monetary units. That's an idea that I think few can't really wrap their head around without a lot of like digging and deep understanding of like finance and like how markets work, especially fractional reserve credit markets.
I think that's a great summary. I think that's an incredible metaphor. And I love what you're talking about with how with political money, we don't know the max supply cap, right? It's like monetary subjectivity versus objectivity, right? And we look at the Renaissance, and the scientific boom, industrial era, and like all that happened because we then create a way to pursue that scientific objectivity and get to the facts, right? And it's like monetary wise, we don't have that. It's basically like rain dancing, and Bitcoin is like that scientific process we finally discovered. At least to me, it seems that way. So
if you had a government body that had so much gold in their reserves and they floated a fixed ratio, let's say 10 paper units for the 1 ounce of gold in their treasury, and they never allowed that amount to change for the paper currency that rode on top of the gold that was in the vault, and it was completely redeemable. So if you went into this bank and you said, here's my 10 paper notes, I want my 1 ounce of gold, they would swap it right there on the spot. And they would never have to worry because they weren't adjusting that ledger of 10 units to 1 ounce. If a government did that, and a government paid for any type of expense that let's say they want to go to war with their neighbor and they run up a big bill, and they then have to pay for it by future production and not adjusting this ledger, and it results in this massive tax to all the citizens during and following that war to pay for it. What happens after that period of time is there's a big recession / depression for that country as they're paying off all of their liabilities and all of the debts that they basically pulled to the left to go to war. Okay. That makes the country more vulnerable for future follow-on attacks if they're going through this period where they're having to pay back neighbors that they borrowed for or whatnot, because they're insisting on having a sound money, a paper money riding on top of their gold. So you can see how this situation, this very inconvenient situation, that the wants that I have today, I don't want to have to deal with the consequences of these short-term interest of me going to war to go fight this other country that pissed me off in the short term. I don't want to deal with the long-term consequences of that. And so the way I'm going to pay for that is, instead of there being 10 paper units that ride for 1 ounce of gold, there's now going to be 20 paper units. And then I'm going to tax the citizens because their buying power is that much worse when they go to trade with another country that thinks that the value of one of these paper units or 10 of these paper units is an ounce of gold that I can go get from their bank. And this situation is what has resulted in gold always failing throughout history. Always. Gold has always failed from a sovereign level. from an individual level, it's obviously protected people during currency collapses. But as a sovereign level instrument, a gold backing has always failed when a paper currency is on top of it. Bitcoin makes this very different, like for the first time in human history, makes it very different.
Yeah, I do my best to frame it, hopefully as well as you just did, about how this is a technological or perhaps engineering problem, is that gold requires that central management, oversight, and storage, right? And that inevitably
Right.
leads to this problem, like you're saying. So in talking about that, the failure of gold and everything that we were talking about before with the expansion of monetary units, you mentioned the M2 chart for the United States. So here's that.
Yeah.
I don't know if, now that we have that visual example, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that in particular, but you were talking earlier about how if we go to any period in American history, this is a line going straight up into the right perpetually into the future, farther and farther. So there we have the 70s and the 80s. There we go out to the 90s a bit later. And then when we're looking at the great financial crisis, we see a uptick here with with TARP and everything else, the bailing out of the banks, the CDO crisis, everything of that sort. But then, like we're talking about, then we go out to the 2020s and COVID, and we see, in my view, what looks like a massive deviation. So I don't know if you have any comments on M2 specifically here, but
yeah, I mean, I'd actually say that the overreaction, the amount of extra monetary units that they added in through COVID was a result of them just not knowing how bad the pandemic was going to be. And the amount that they've been able to contract it since is also a function of how COVID wasn't nearly as bad as what they had prepared for with the amount of monetary units that they added into the system. So the reason they've been able to tighten as much as they have is because the impact back when they added so many monetary units into the system wasn't as prolonged and devastating to the economy as what they had prepared for. Now, if you pull that chart back up, Luke, look at where we're at from just a trend line standpoint. Like if you were going to extend the previous trend out, you're getting very close to where it would naturally have been if they didn't do any of this anyway, which tells me that you are about to see a swift change in M2 growth back to what I would tell you is about a 7 to 8% growth rate on an annualized basis. That's what that chart was showing you. So now if you did a log chart of that same one that you pulled up, it would just be a nice straight line that just keeps going from left to right. And so
I'm really fascinated. Sorry to interrupt. I'm really fascinated because that was a question I have written down. I was asking you if you think the COVID stimulus in 2020 leapfrogged the cycle, right? Because you mentioned the 10 trillion, and then you had COVID, which was 5 to 6 trillion, and then before that you had the Trouble Asset Relief Program, 2009, 800 billion, 500 billion, or whatever, and that's like skipping an order of magnitude between there. So it seems like that you believe that the COVID was basically skipping an extra cycle, going above that average rate, and now that's the only reason that we're able to tighten as much as we can.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's why you were able to get it back to where it's at. But I would say I don't think they can go much further than where they're at right now. I don't see that happening. Like you're going to see M2 expand from here. Moving forward. Now, in the next 3 months or 6 months, sure, you might see it drop a little bit more. But on a very zoomed out view of like what you just showed, like that chart is going to continue to just rip at least at 7% annualized from where we're at moving forward. And so, yeah. Yeah, go ahead with your question. Sorry.
No, it's all right. What is the 7? I was just wanting to clarify the 7%. That's what you think M2 is, right? Not assets on the balance.
Yeah, the M2 alone is your growth rate. So like when you're looking at that M2 growth rate, I would tell you that's the true number of the inflation.
Okay.
Because that's the expansion of monetary units in the system. And so how those freshly printed units manifest themselves is why inflation is so difficult and confusing for people to wrap their head around. So like as these monetary units enter the system, do they go into bidding the prices of stocks? Does that cause stocks to go up? Maybe, and when you look at the sheer size, because what you're talking about is expanding every dollar in the system by 7%. That pool of money is massive, massive, like trillions and trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars that you're expanding by 7%. So let's say, for simplicity's sake, and this is not the number, but this is a big number. Let's just say that the amount of dollars in the system is 100 trillion. It's bigger than that, but let's just say it's 100 trillion dollars in the system. And let's say that the oil market is, and I should know this number, but I don't. Let's say that's $1 trillion market. When you look at a 7% growth rate of 100 trillion, which would be 7 trillion, and that enters into the system, the ones that are very small markets are going to be, and desirable markets are going to be impacted in what would look like massive amounts of inflation. The larger markets, call it the treasury markets, bond market, that is in excess of 100 trillion, by the way. It's not going to be impacted nearly as much by that 7 trillion growth rate in M2 because of the sheer size of it. And so people would point to something like that and say, oh, there's no inflation happening here, right? So when people say this word in the CPI or inflation, like it's so dependent on what basket you're looking at, what's the size of the basket, what's the change in supply and demand dynamics of the basket. But nobody ever takes a step back and says, well, how big is the pool of cash? Like if the ocean was representative of the fiat money and we had a 7% growth rate in the amount of water in the oceans, what would be the impact to land mass around the world? It would be insanely significant. Now, if you take that 107 trillion units and you add another 7% to that number, which is how this works, because you're continuing the 7% on the growth rate from the previous year, all of a sudden, like you're starting to really push around really small markets really fast. So if we're talking about the size of the coffee market, or we're talking about the size of whatever, you name it, right? I'd have to think here for a little bit to think of a really small commodity market. But you better believe that the prices inside of that commodity market are going to get whipsawed even more and more and more as these monetary units continue to expand and expand and expand bigger and bigger.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But the root of inflation is the number of monetary units in that system.
Yeah.
The effects of it are very dynamic and constantly changing, because like if you go back to like COVID, like we saw a big disruption in microprocessors that started to play out. And so you saw inflation like really, really massive in that area, to the tune of like, thousands of vehicles sitting in GM lots that they couldn't even finish because they were missing microprocessors, because the prices were going berserk and like you just couldn't get your hands on it. So like there's impacts that are happening, and this is really important. So as we continue down this path of the money breaking, okay, what you're going to find is the amount of units that they have to add in because of this compounding impact of the growth rate of fiat currency and the consolidation of capital into fewer and fewer hands. These smaller markets are getting whipsawed around so much so that small participants that are trying to start a business, they can't handle that volatility, which makes the supply chain even more fragile for whatever part. The more complex the component, the more vulnerable it is to these supply chain impacts, because it relies on 1,000 pieces and parts that are upstream of them putting it together. And so when we look at like So what happens on this incoming cycle that we're just about to go through? Because we are seeing deflationary forces, impairment, going back to the idea of credit impairment. You're seeing all these monetary units collapse, which is what they want. So it looks like they're getting inflation under control. But as they step back in and they manipulate the market by putting so many more monetary units into the system, what's going to come out that on the other side is double digit. Like we got up to, how high did it get here in the US, Luke? Like 8 or 9% inflation?
8 or 9% inflation official. Yeah.
On their CPI gauge, right? It's been 8% for decades, people. 7-8% for you can look at the M2 chart and you can see it.
Well, it's because the government's picking the right, you've been talking, they pick a different mixed basket and they say this is the inflation rate. Yeah.
But as we get to the end of this bloodletting cycle where you're about to kill the patient, okay, what's playing out, and that's what's playing out. What you're going to see next. So we got to 8 or 9% inflation. You're going to go through this big deflationary wave. They're going to have to print a ton of more monetary units to keep that trend line going on pace. Okay. And when they do that, when they step back into the market, the overall economy is that much more fragile than it was before COVID. And so what you're going to see is inflation manifest itself in ways that are unimaginable to a person before what we just went through. Like they thought what we went through COVID was bad. What we're about to go through in what I would say is probably 3 years time from now is going to be double digit inflation. Like you are going double digit inflation because here in the US, even in their own gauge, even in their own CPI gauge, people would say you're already there. And I would agree. But in their CPI gauge, they're going to be printing over double digit inflation because of how wrecked naturally free and open market forces have become to try to subsidize and offset all the naturally occurring creative destruction that's trying to manifest itself, but never fully manifest itself through each of these cycles.
Wow. Yeah. So you think 10 trillion plus is next as far as the new number of monetary units, and you think that within 3 years we're probably looking at over 10% official inflation in the US. Yeah, I think those are bold claims, but I think if you understand that the problem is not the captain steering the ship, but it's an engineering problem of the ship itself, I think it's becomes a lot more reasonable, and I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, I think by like 27, by 2027, you should probably see like double. And in the meantime, what's really going to like make me sound like out there is you could see like deep deflationary forces in 2024. Like you could see their CPI prints go deeply negative in 2024 and maybe even into 2025. But I think once they respond to it, the amount that they're going to have to respond to it with is going to be so destructive to the economy, to anybody that can like compete with the Googles, Apples, and like the dominant players that are just sucking up liquidity and value out of the system. You can't even compete with these players. And like the balance sheets of some of these players are like bigger than countries, like GDPs and stuff. So like you're at an end game where like going back to the bloodletting, like the body is now saying, okay, I need like the whole cell needs to be nothing but mitochondria. The lungs need to be the size of the person's entire chest. And like there's a couple things that are being optimized for the body, and it's just like it's a fatality at that point. And that's what's happening with the economy.
Yeah, so all of this is based on history of the last few decades. You mentioned a couple times now M2 on a log scale. You mentioned stocks earlier about how stocks is one of these things that's getting bid up. And this is one of the things actually in my very first thread all the way back in January, the one that you saw that eventually, got me on your podcast, right? Got me on your show. This was something in my very first thread here. I pulled it up for us to look at and show our viewers here. But in the blue line, we have what Preston's been talking about. Thank you. But yeah, we have the blue line, what Preston's talking about. Money supply in blue on a logarithmic scale, right? So again, that's talking 10, 100,000 units of 10, not units of one, two, three. And then we also have on the green line, we have the S&P 500, which is, the US stock market, basically. So even though this chart's about, 10, 11 months old now, obviously the point's the same. This is going all the way back out to the early 1970s, 1970, 1971. So Preston, obviously, when we look at this, we see periods where the stocks go up over the line, like the dot-com bubble here in 2000. We can see that. And then later on, the great financial crisis, where it goes down, and briefly for like this 10-year period is flatlined. Basically, the decade is flat. But
Yeah.
in the long term, it's just going up and doing this. So in the future, I guess my question to you with this is, why do you so many people talk about how they think it's going to go off the rails and hyperinflation or whatever is possible, but I look at those last 50 years and it seems like stable bloodletting. So why do you think, if we're having this slow, stable bloodletting, why do you think it could go off the rails? Or maybe you don't think it would go off the rails? Like, when you look at that chart, what do you think in 50 years from now? Yeah.
What you're not seeing in that chart is the domination of the top equity holders of the S&P 500, right?
The big seven, right?
Yeah, the big seven. So like if you went back and you looked very early in the chart, right? And I usually don't like charts where the y-axis is on the left and the right side, and because sometimes it can be distorted. But in this particular chart, it's actually quite awesome because it's a 10-to-1 ratio. Like if you look over at 30 trillion, it's 3K. If you look at the 10 trillion, it's almost equivalent to your 1K. If you look at the 4 trillion, it's equivalent to your 400. So like it's very proportional, a 10-to-1 ratio between the money supply growth and the S&P 500. And if you were going to ask me what would be the best way for a person to protect against this quote unquote 7% debasement rate of M2 through that period of time, I would tell you the NASDAQ, I would tell you the S&P 500. You'd have to own like the top dominating equities in the world to protect yourself just from the debasement of the currency itself. So to answer your question, like, what is it that we're not seeing that happened over that period of time that when we play it forward from here, that people aren't prepared for? It's that, going back to the bloodletting example, the lungs are the size of the entire chest. The mitochondria, there's nothing left to you can't even put DNA in the cell anymore because there's so many mitochondria in every cell that it's the only thing that's left. And so when we look at the S&P 500, if we could market cap weight just the 10 companies, the top 10 companies in the 500, it would drive the entire indice. But if you went back when we went onto the petrodollar system, that would not have been the scenario, where you would have saw a much more homogeneous amount of businesses that made up the overall S&P 500 index. So as you continue to play this forward and you continue to debase 7% on an exponential curve, what you're finding is that all of that value accretion is pouring itself into only a few hands, which makes I use this example. I swear to God, I feel like I use this example in every single interview, and I'm tired of using it, but it's the only way I can get the point through. It'd be like a forest. It would be like a predator totally dominating its environment so that there's no creatures left for it to feast on. Okay. And you know what happens in those environments? The predator eventually kills itself because it literally ate and devoured everything in its environment. That's where this is going. It's like the whole system is becoming extremely unstable because all value accretion is manifesting itself into the hands of just a few parties. And that is a very extremely unstable ecosystem environment for business, for free and open markets. Why do you think that there's an attack on capitalism right now? It's because A, we don't have capitalism. A, we have an environment where government is stepping in and just totally like a puppeteer, like controlling where these funds flow. And so people who are saying capitalism is a failing model and isn't fair to everybody, well, my response to that person is, so you think this is capitalism right now? Like, this isn't capitalism.
Yeah.
Um,
Money is the largest quote unquote market in the world, right? And that's not a free market, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And like,
yeah. Yeah.
and I've said this on a lot of interviews as well, which is just like the price of everything on the planet. I don't care if you're talking about some chapstick, or you're talking about some beef that you went and bought, or you're talking about a car you just went and purchased. It all comes down to the cost of capital, the cost of money. Okay. The cost of money for anybody like, if you're a billionaire and you've played this game really well and you have all this, all these assets, I can tell you right now, no billionaire on this planet would ever do an investment that's not giving them at least 7 or 8%. They won't do it, because whether they realize that that's the M2 growth rate or not, which many of them might not realize that that's like the real debasement rate. Okay. So many will, but if they don't, they intuitively understand that that's their hurdle rate that they have to outperform to grow their capital base. They have to.
No.
Yeah. And
It's
and so if we looked at the S&P 500, or we look at stocks right now, most of them are priced at like a 3 or 4% return if you buy them right now. So like, if you buy them at their current price, you're underperforming just the M2 growth rate by, like, call it 4%, because of how they're priced right now. Now, if they go screaming down, like, well, you had a little bit of a buying opportunity where you had better PE ratios, which would bring that more in line with just keeping pace with the debasement rate. I would argue right now, like, pretty much anything that's a large cap or mid cap, like, you are underperforming just the debasement rate of 7 or 8% by 3 or 4%.
That's crazy. That's crazy. It's this whole, and I talked about this when I came on your show too, about the incentives are aligned in that way to where we have to continue centralizing. You talked about why is there more and more hate against capitalism? Why is there more and more centralization? Why all these things? You mentioned earlier about how this largest sector in the United States is the financial management regulation. It's like the biggest industry in the world is that monopoly of trying to either control or try to predict and be ahead of the control of that cost of capital as everything continues to centralize more and more and more. So
yeah. Well, to the point of the one other thing that I was trying to say, but I forgot to say on the cost of capital. If you're manipulating the cost of capital, you're effectively doing price controls for everything. So, like, going back to the vehicle, the beef, or the chapstick, like, you're trying to control the price of all of that stuff simultaneously. Everybody knows that when you step into a market and you try to control the price of a specific thing, that you're actually causing that ecosystem to operate less efficiently. And a lot of people use, like, the generator example of, like, price controls on generators during, like, a flood or something like that. Like, the most efficient way that you can manage those generators to get to where they need to go is by not implementing price controls, because they'll start charging higher prices, and the people that desperately need those generators for whatever reason are going to pay up to own them. So you can argue that in that emergency scenario, those generators are going to go where they're needed most holistically across that ecosystem by not stepping in and adjusting the price. And so when we're playing around with the cost of capital, we're playing around with the price of everything, which means we're making everything less efficient and less, value accretive for the whole.
Yeah, we're making everything less efficient, but we're making it less efficient slow enough, because a hurricane is a short-term event. It's immediate, it's now. But because it's more abstract, like what you're describing, because it's across everything, I think it's harder for us to pick up on that and realize, well, then, Bitcoin's a scam. It's, blah, blah, blah. But then it's like, oh, wait, the whole worldview we have right now is trying to survive this hurricane, the aftermath of this hurricane, slowly. And it's like Bitcoin offers this idea, well, what if we can save our money and we don't have to have our whole business and mindset be around trying to survive the slow
Yeah,
the slow death, basically.
exactly.
So looking forward here, also talking about, we talked about the amounts. We talked about 10 trillion as an amount. We talked about 10% speed or whatever. I have a question about timeline because there's this famous or infamous statement that I talk about and how many others talk about, the stat, and it's about assets, it's about liabilities, and it's about sovereign debt to GDP. So if we look here at total assets of the Fed, obviously we see this in 2008 with that centralization, like we're talking about. Obviously this indirectly results in that manipulation of cost of capital, increased centralization of the economy that's making the economy weaker and weaker. And then if we go out, to the 2020 era, obviously that gets dwarfed by what's happening. And that's what we're talking about, how probably the next cycle is going to be even more dramatic than this. But when it comes to looking at sovereign debt to GDP, Preston, you've heard this, I'm sure, and many others have heard me say it too, about how 98% of the nations or empires that reach 130% sovereign debt to GDP either have hyperinflation, default, or war within 15 years. And we can see here after, at 2008, we were at 63%. We hit the 80, 90, 100% range in the 2010s. And for the first time here in 2020, we surpassed 130%. I think we peaked at 136% briefly, if I remember correctly. And then since then, we've come down back into the 100 and teens or so. Yeah, 118, 119, 120. So when you hear people talk about that stat, Preston, that 98% of the countries that have hit this threshold have hyperinflation, default, of war within 15 years, which would be 2035. Do you think that that is accurate? Do you think it's inaccurate because obviously GDP is being manipulated as we manipulate the cost of capital? Like, do you even try to put a timeline to this? Like, what do you think? I mean, there's the digital era too, making everything faster. There's so many variables here. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if you had a culture that was collectively trying to become more responsible and to deal with the problem that's in front of them, like that's probably going to extend that timeline out. If you have the opposite culturally, where everybody's just wanting a handout and just saying, hey, where's my money? I want another stimulus check and all that, it may actually accelerate that timeline to the left. Because at the core of that is the cultural cognitive ability to first define the problem and then engineer a solution, or at least try to engineer a solution to the said problem. But I personally think today that at least in Europe, in the US, basically all the debtor nation states that are net consumers, culturally are rot. And I think that is going to potentially accelerate it faster than 15 years. Now, how much, I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that to play it safe, I would agree with the, once you hit the 130, you're within a 15-year window. Yeah, I would say we're there and maybe to the left of there.
Bitcoin is incredible and it's incredibly important, which is why it means a lot that you're watching this video and you're taking the time. I do this because I believe it is a really, really important innovation that we've discovered a way to not have a single point of failure at global base layer money. See, fiat money, political currency units, and gold, all other forms of money up to this point in history have had a single point of failure. This has been the largest monetary problem in human history for the last 4,000 years. And now we have Bitcoin, and Bitcoin solves that single point of failure problem. And now, therefore, we have a new single point of failure problem, and that is, how do we custody and store that Bitcoin properly for the long term in a safe and secure way that brings peace of mind? That's why I work at the Bitcoin Advisor. If you were to be hit by a bus, does your spouse, do your kids, do your loved ones and beneficiaries know how to access your Bitcoin? Do you have a proper self-custody storage method to where there is no single point of failure? Not from yourself, not from your seed device, not from where your seed phrase is stored. Have you considered these questions? Have you gotten your UTXOs managed? Do you have jurisdictional arbitrage? Have you considered all the trust, taxes, and estate planning requirements that are associated with becoming a high net worth person? Because if you are buying Bitcoin right now, you are going to become a high net worth person. Are you prepared for the amount of Bitcoin you have to skyrocket in value 2x, 5x, 10x, or 100x eventually? That's the time horizon you should have. And so you need to be preparing today for that future. How are you going to custody your Bitcoin? How are you going to leave that Bitcoin for your future generations? Because after all, that's what we do this for, right? You're buying Bitcoin for your kids. You're buying it for your grandkids. And so I highly recommend you start thinking in those long-term time periods now, because companies are coming, charities are coming, high net worth individuals are coming, and all of them are going to realize that having an allocation to a multi-sig collateral custody vault is going to be something that is of serious consideration for them. So once you understand Bitcoin is a beautiful innovation for not having a single point of failure at the base layer currency, now you have to start seriously considering, how do I have my custody stored where there is no single point of failure? Okay, if you want to learn more about that, please click the link in the description. I have dozens of pages of free educational content for you and videos. I'm happy to help in that free way. And then if you want individual help, I'm also happy to help you join the Bitcoin Advisor, where you can be an ongoing client. You can become one of my clients, and I'd be happy to help you in the years to come to make sure your Bitcoin's protected, to where no matter what, no matter if thieves or scammers or spammers or yourself or your family or whoever, no matter whether it's due to theft or loss, misallocation, misplacement, or just other mistakes, I'm happy to help you and be that voice of reason in the coming years ahead. So click the link in the description. I'd be happy to help. Check it out. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty brutal. I think for Bitcoin, most people I don't think will start buying Bitcoin until they realize the things we've been talking about, and not that, oh, Bitcoin is this magic number made up on the screen. Why do I ever trust someone else's set of numbers? When my set of numbers, it's being solely bloodlet, 7% of yours just fine.
Yeah.
I think when they start realizing Bitcoin as that risk off perspective, that's when they begin to shift. So when that happens, when things come off the rails, whether that's 5 years, 15 years, or farther out, whenever that happens, whatever amount, 10 trillion or more, whatever percentage interest rate, inflation rate, 10% or more, whenever that happens, what do you think that looks like for Bitcoin? Like, do you think it's a vertical spike up? Do you think it's like a stair step process? Do you think it's, what do you think when it comes to Bitcoin price, Bitcoin adoption? What are we going to feel when we're undergoing this? As fiat degrades, how are we going to see that bursting of energy moving over towards our system?
Having been through a couple cycles and just kind of seeing how the populace kind of reacts, I remember when we in the 2017 cycle, when Bitcoin was ripping past 10,000 and made a run at 20,000. I remember the topic coming up during White House press conferences, like just very briefly. Like there was people from the press asking the White House press officer, like, what's going on with Bitcoin? And I remember sitting there watching it and saying, oh dear God, like this is getting wild. Like, where does this go from here? Like, all sense of like what was a reasonable or like any type of projection for me was just totally out the window. Like I didn't know if I didn't know what was going to happen. But I remember the conversation reaching that level and thinking, oh dear God, I don't think anybody can possibly predict what comes next. Then we went through this last cycle, and it ripped up to 69,000, and you had intense selling pressure happening from FTX and all these other bad actors that, in my opinion, greatly suppressed the price of where it would have gone if everybody would have been acting in a way that wasn't selling other people's deposits in, as the market's running hot. And you might have saw 150,000 or something like that very naturally, if you didn't have these literally parasite bad actors doing what they were doing. Just because kind of at the end you get this pinch where like there's literally just no supply, and the speculators are just ripping it to levels like that. I say all that because I think after this has been at such a high level on a global scale, everybody in the world has heard of Bitcoin. Everybody. Everybody has heard of Bitcoin for probably about 5 years now. Because I know back in 2017, it was commonly discussed on CNBC, and people were just kind of shaking their head and laughing. So people were hearing it. I think that there's something very cognitive that changes in the perception after the patient has died 3 times previously and has come back to life. And there's people trading these fake imaginary Mario coins for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I think at a certain point of like the 4th time it's come back to life, and you're talking like numbers that are the sizes of like people's homes, like there's just something very different that starts to change and snap in their minds of like, clearly I'm missing something. There is something here that I just cannot possibly figure out. I got to that point with Tesla, to be honest with you. Like as a value investor, like hardcore value investor, I was like looking at Tesla. The price kept ripping. It kept going higher and higher. I thought the valuations were insane. I even, I understood the argument. Well, you're creating this network and other cars are going to plug into the network, and it's an AI company, and it's looking at patterns of light. Like I understood all of it, but still the valuations were crazy to me. But at a certain price, after it kept going and going, I just said, you know what? There's something the market sees in this that I clearly don't, and that I don't recognize. And so like my choice was to not participate, even though it resulted in me missing out on an enormous amount of capital appreciation if I would have bought the stock early on. You're still going to have people like that, but you also are going to have people that say, I just need to have a small portion of this in my portfolio, especially if a BlackRock or a Fidelity or somebody comes out and says, we think it's responsible for you to have a 1% position in Bitcoin. And I think that is way more in the cards than people realize, like way more, like it's coming a lot faster than I think people realize, that particular aspect. So all of that, like, why am I saying that? So it's a suddenly then all at once type thing. Where that occurs, I think, is on the verge of like trying to predict an avalanche. But I also think that based on some of the things that I just laid out, I think we're getting closer to it than further away from it. Like I think you're in a 10-year window where this thing could have the potential to just really rip, like past 1 million. I'm not saying that on the neck. We could maybe get to 1 million like here in the coming 8 years. But like once you get by 1 million, I think it's going to be hard to slow it down. Like I think it's then all at once type thing. Oh, you're on mute.
On mute because you have so many good points there. Yeah, one of those good points I think is what you're basically describing unit bias, right? In a large aspect. Most people, not only have they heard of Bitcoin, said it was dead, and then a couple years later, oh, it didn't die, it's back and it's higher. Oh, it didn't die, it's back, it's higher. And now most people are coming out to the 4th time. I think it's not also the number of times they hear about it and see that it's come back to life, but I think it's the price at which it's at. Most people only have ever heard about Bitcoin at $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, $35,000, 15. They've only heard about it in the thousands or tens of thousands. However, obviously, the further back in Bitcoin you go, you realize, wait, it was 10 cents and it was $1. It was $5. Like for people in 2013, their unit bias was $5, $50, $22, right? For people a couple years later, it was $100, $500, $350. And now, to your point about hitting $1 million in the future, I think it's going to be that additional touch point, but then also having their unit bias be shifted upwards dramatically. So are you saying that once it hits $1 million, you think that's when people really start to shift that unit bias, really start to shift that perspective, and that's when they start to have your quote-unquote Tesla moment? I'm curious, by the way, what you think you missed with Tesla, if you don't mind sharing. But whenever they miss, what do you think that $1 million is where they realize, oh, I might have missed something, and perhaps a higher allocation is deserving?
I don't know if it's 1 million. I don't know if it's 500,000, 3 million. It's really hard for me to, I think because I just have such a, I think I have a unit bias of where I kind of came into the market. So like those numbers from where my anchor is at is so absurdly obvious that this is taking over, right? That I just can't even wrap my head around how people can't see it. But for most participants, they don't own any or they haven't owned any. And so like 500,000, they're still in the camp of these people have literally, like, the world has gone mad, maybe. So I don't know, but there will be a flippening. I think the other part that we're not even talking about, so we're just talking about like Bitcoin as the answer, but what we're not talking about is the destruction in the backdrop of Bitcoin that we're talking about. And in that backdrop is double digit inflation. Is I can't even afford to go out to eat anymore. Like I can barely afford to just get groceries, let alone go out to the luxury of going out to eat. Like those types of things is going to help people see this thing that is the solution to all their woes and their issues. I think AI greatly accelerates that macro destructive backdrop as well. Yeah, so it's really kind of both of those. The contrast between those two things is what is going to make it just obvious at a certain point.
Yeah, I think for every person, it's an individual point. And at a certain point, I don't think we're only going to be talking about people and corporations and retirees with their 401ks, but eventually governments, right? One of the most viewed shows you ever had for Bitcoin is your Jason Lowry discussion, right? And I think when I hear his worldview, and obviously he's a controversial figure in Bitcoin with a lot of people, but I think the larger idea he brings up is really interesting and compelling. And so we've talked a lot about governments, balance sheets, all that, and now we're talking about that unit bias and people making that shift and crossing the chasm. What do you think happens if and when governments start to cross that chasm and they realize we need Bitcoin on our balance sheets, we need Bitcoin for this, we need Bitcoin for that? Because unlike retirees with their 401ks, where they only have a certain number of those monetary units in their retirement fund, the governments can just create more monetary units, back those monetary units with Bitcoin to therefore create more monetary. Like, do you think that's possible? Do you think that's pretty far out and yet ways to happen? And what do you think happens to Bitcoin when that occurs?
I stick by this idea that the countries that have benefited the most from the past 40-year-old system, the petrodollar system, should just naturally have the hardest time understanding Bitcoin. And even if they do understand Bitcoin, they're incentivized to act like they don't understand Bitcoin because of the power that they wield around and the equity that they hold and the political influence that they have. So it should make sense that those that benefited the most are the ones that try to fight and battle this the hardest. The ones that have been the countries that have been the victims of dollar dominance, petrodollar system should be the ones that embrace this and see it for what it is the quickest, and they benefit the most from it. So to say U.S. centric opinion or to say a Germany opinion or whatever is kind of futile in my opinion, simply because in a lot of these countries, the political the people that are kind of wielding the power around is changed out so frequently that it's a little difficult for me to, like, in a year and a half from now, we're going to have a different president. And like in one spectrum, you could have RFK, who's very pro Bitcoin, that could come in with a whole new site picture and policy standpoint that would attract a lot of Bitcoin businesses into the country. Or you could have more of the same, which I would tell you has been very policy wise threatening to anybody, especially this new FinCEN proposal that's coming out is very threatening to any business that would be standing up a business here in the US. So that can change, and you can have one-off scenarios that would prove the overarching thesis of the ones that benefited the most are going to be the ones that fight it the hardest. You're going to have one-offs that don't necessarily kind of substantiate that thesis. And it really kind of comes down to the political leader that's elected, their actual influence for implementing change, what type of, like the Congress, like they could, if you get a president that's like RFK, that maybe the reaction shortly after there, 2 years later in Congress would be that it would be filled with people that would be battling against that and trying to keep the status quo. So I'm not giving you a solid answer, but I'm giving you, I guess, a framework for like how to think through how this will naturally evolve.
Yep, I think oftentimes those are the better answers, right? Oftentimes I think it's hard to predict the thing, and it's easier to predict the feedback loop that leads to the thing, right? So in regards to those feedback loops, obviously I don't know how much you get into it, but you have a background in the military sector and all that, and you've seen that world up close. When you look at Bitcoin and the feedback loop that occurs from that, you talked about before about how we can finance wars, taking prosperity gains from the future, spending them today to, fight with guns and bullets. When you look at the future and you try to think of Bitcoin in the future, do you think credit markets and do you think wars exist in that Bitcoin future? Or if they still exist, and what ways do both of those things change? So the government controlling the economy and the cost of capital / credit markets, and the government controlling the guns and the tanks and the bullets. Well, what ways do you see those things changing in a mass adopted Bitcoin world?
I think that, okay, so yeah, if you're on the other side of this and Bitcoin is fully adopted, it's pretty much the only thing people will accept for payment. You're almost in an inverted situation as you are today, which is lots of war, lots of defense spending, lots of credit. You literally have the polar opposite of that. Could it still exist? Of course. Will it exist at the magnitude that it is now? Definitely not. Especially on the credit side, because I think the need for all this credit creation really withers away. I think you'll still have credit, but it's going to be in, like on the venture capital side of the house. There's companies that take on VC money in exchange for equity. And then the company is growing like crazy, and the company doesn't want to give up equity, but the investors can see that it's just totally dominating market share and that it is something that is very promising. And in that scenario, those entrepreneurs that are leading that organization have a considerable incentive to do a debt offering as opposed to selling more equity, because they want to continue to control their equity. So they'd rather pay it back as coupons and not necessarily have to give up any more equity. So like in a scenario like that, I think that debt could continue to be issued. Our understanding of governments funding themselves to like absurd, like never ending expansion of credit, like that does not happen in this new system. There's no incentive for a citizen who's squatting on money that continues to hold and maybe even slightly appreciate in value because of lost coins or whatever, are going to sit around and allow elected officials to do like what they do right now. Right now, the name of the game is, I want to get this person into office that can debase this money as fast as possible, because they can vote a lot of it back into my district for the F-35 program or whatever defense program that lies inside of their district, because that's good for them locally. It is the classic, it's good for me at the individual level, bad for the macro. The tragedy of the commons is what it is. That's what fiat through and through. Bitcoin, I think it changes a lot of that tragedy of the commons scenario that currently exists, not just here in the US, literally on a global scale, because everybody's using this fiat way of government leadership. See, I think it changes. Now in the interim from now till then, I think that you could actually see conflict and everything else, maybe even escalate further probably escalate even further here in the coming 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Well, again, 130% debt GDP, hyperinflation and war, right? So probably some of those will not tilt to the hyperinflation side, but some of the war side, unfortunately.
And on the hyperinflation side, like just like to clear up terminology, like in Bitcoin terms, we've been experiencing hyperinflation since the beginning. Like my unit of account is Bitcoin. Like when I view my net worth, it's in Bitcoin terms. And it has been for quite a while. And so like for me personally, I've been experiencing hyperinflation ever since I became a Bitcoiner. And so so is everybody else. Like they just don't know it yet. But hyperinflation is happening. It's happening if you're using Bitcoin as your unit of account. And another, like prices just keep going down for me because I value everything in Bitcoin. Like when I go to the grocery store, the prices are cheaper now than they were 3 years ago or 4 years ago or whatever. Like the prices just keep going down. Now there's quite a bit of volatility in this, but for like the time frame that I've been in Bitcoin, like my God, it's a little crazy to think in 2025 it's going to be a decade. But like when I look at that, like the prices just keep going down. Life's pretty dang good. And hyperinflation is happening, but you know, as long as you store any type of retained savings in Bitcoin, like you should be good. I think the problem that maybe a lot of people have, they don't have any disposable income. So like they can't save in Bitcoin. And so they're much more prone to the experience of this hyperinflation. You know, if you're comparing hyperinflation to like the dollar and like let's say, okay, well, let's compare it to the euro. Well, the dollar isn't really changing that much compared to the euro. That's because the euro is hyperinflating just like the dollar, just like every other yen, yuan, you name the currency. They're all hyperinflating against Bitcoin. Every one of them.
Yeah. That's a fascinating way to put it. You know, I've not really thought of that before. I've thought about how Bitcoin supply was inflating at a dramatic rate, you know, back in 2009, 10, 11, 12, you know, the first halving or cycle or two, you know, supply was dramatic. But as far as what you're describing about how in political currency hyperinflations, you know, prices just go up faster and faster and faster, meaning their money's withering away faster and faster. It's like the way the world which we're in now is these financialized assets are depreciating at that hyperinflationary rate with Bitcoin being flat. It's like this, that's just such an interesting thought of inverting that hyperinflation. You're right that we're already living in it and we're experiencing that now. It's just most people,
they're not looking at that as their unit of account. Yeah.
They're not looking.
And if you're looking at like what that compound annual growth rate, the CAGR of it is, I would strongly encourage, I tell people, if you're holding Bitcoin for less than 4 years, you might as well treat it as a speculation. If you're holding it for more than 4 years, you can treat it as a unit of account or, you know, like an investment or whatever terminology you want to slap to it. So if you pick any 4-year period on the Bitcoin price chart, like you could pick today, go back 4 years. You could pick the bull top that we experienced at 69,000, go back 4 years. You could pick the bottom of, call it 16,000, 15,000 or whatever it was, and go back 4 years. When you do a compound annual growth rate of that 4-year period, the percent annually that it's growing is close to 100% annualized. It's definitely in excess of what you would call hyperinflation, which I think is, what is it, 40%, Luke?
It's 50%, I think, is the official.
Yeah,
but
so
it's a little silly to me because it's, you know, the continental dollar, for example, the United States, or the Confederate dollar, also the United States, or, you know, during the war, obviously. But, you know, both of those were not officially, quote unquote, hyperinflation because they were at the high 40s, right? So to me, the official number is 50%, but I think of it more like a gradation, right? It's not like
but you're
magically
there.
50%.
You're definitely over 50% with Bitcoin on any 4-year period of time you can pluck off the chart. You're exceeding 50% annualized.
Yeah.
Right. So, and like any Bitcoin I buy, I'm buying it to hold it in excess of 4 years. I can tell you that. And so, yeah, for me, I'm just like, I look at it like hyperinflation's happening. It's happening in Bitcoin terms. The rest of the world's going to come to that realization because this train's not letting up. Like my expectations for 2024 by the end of 2024 is, I think it's going to be nuts as to like what it does in terms of fiat currency.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, you talked about picking the top, picking the bottom when it comes to Bitcoin, thinking of 4 years, which is funny because you are one of the few people on Twitter that publicly tweeted at the very bottom for Bitcoin, right? I forget exactly what you said, but you tweeted about how you were deploying your free cash flows or something and encourage people to stay safe and all that. But you bought the bottom basically, and a lot of people try to do that. Obviously, I'm sure neither of us are encouraging people to try to time the market, but I'm curious personally, what made you decide this is the moment? Was it the FTX implosion? Was it how did you know? And what can we all learn from your
early in the year
wisdom?
So this was early in 2022. I tweeted out that I was going to start saving all of my money in dollars, in cash, this horrible fiat currency that I've just spent an hour and a half talking about. I went on Peter McCormick's show, talked about why I was doing that and storing all of my retained earnings in cash, and I was going to deploy it all back into Bitcoin whenever I felt like the time was right, and whenever I thought that there was a change in policy from the central planners that are manipulating all this money. So yeah, that's what I did. I took all the cash flows that I saved for the year and I bought Bitcoin with it at that moment. But I do not recommend anybody does that at all. Like I did it because I get a kick out of it. And I feel like even if I kind of made some mistakes, this is really important too. I didn't sell the Bitcoin that I had.
Yes.
When the market was up, I just continued to hold it. I make free cash flows just like other people have disposable income. I saved all those free cash flows for a year and then I bought Bitcoin with it. So even if I was wrong, let's say I was 6 months into this and Bitcoin ripped, let's say some major massive government stepped in and said, we all own Bitcoin, and Bitcoin ripped to 150,000. And I would have looked so dumb. And you know what, Luke? I was prepared for that. I was having fun. But I think for a lot of people, they can't afford to be stupid like that. Because I really mean this. I really mean this. Like what I was doing was more for my own personal enjoyment than what I would have said was a smart and thoughtful approach. Now, it might look like it was brilliant or like a smart, thoughtful approach, but I'm here to tell you it was not. I should have just taken whatever I've got and just bought Bitcoin with it, without even thinking about it, and just dollar cost averaged. Okay. But I personally get a lot of pleasure out of playing in these markets. I wasn't doing anything risky. Like my treasury completely offset the amount that I was playing around with for the annual free cash flows, right? So like I was making a, some people say, and I don't think this is smart either, but there's a lot of people that have like play positions, and then there's people who have investments that they don't mess with. And I guess I was kind of doing something like that. But I don't recommend people try to do that. I think that there was an extraordinary amount of luck involved with it. What was I thinking when I did it? Well, I was looking at factors like previous 4-year cycles, where they were at that moment in time and where they kind of typically bottom. I was looking at the sheer panic and fear that was being induced by FTX's collapse and a bunch of other things, which I thought was a total overreaction in the market. it was having family and friends coming up to me and saying, "Oh, how about," like in a very egotistical way, "How about that Bitcoin with the elbow jab?" It was people on Twitter making their comments. It was like all of that together that I was looking at and saying, right there, this is what it feels like, because it felt absolutely excruciatingly terrible. And that's why I did it. And that's why I made the call when I did, is because I've participated in markets enough times to know when is the absolute worst time for me to sell a position or to buy a position. And I know what that feels like. And I just acted off of that gut feeling based on some of those factors.
Yeah. You've experienced it before. Yeah.
It's when
So
it's when the Mike Greens and the Brian Johnsons and the people like that are taking their victory lap, that you know that you're experiencing some type of local bottom.
yeah.
And it's when like hardcore Bitcoiners like myself are rubbing the noses in people like that, when you're probably hitting highs, or at least local highs.
Yeah. Local highs or local tops or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's so much more I want to ask you about. I know we're running out of time here. One thing that people always ask me in regards to, most people, well, I've been very fortunate to go to a lot of Bitcoin events and conferences, and most people found me through your show. If any singular piece of content that I've ever been in a part of or made this year, thus far, it's been your show more than anything. And the first thing you're like, "Oh yeah, you're the guy in Preston's show. I saw that. I loved it. Oh wow, Preston's so great," right? So everyone always loves to talk about how you're a great interviewer and about how you have the greatest guests on. And I'm amazed and thrilled just how well my show on yours did. Like, when you asked me to
It
come on your
crushed it.
show,
You had
I
very good
know.
numbers, Luke. Yes.
I know. It's like it's something like the fifth or sixth most ever viewed Bitcoin podcast, at least on YouTube, you've ever done, right? Like, it shocked me. I thought I was going to go on and get like a little below average views, because everyone's like, who's this, weird 20, who's this kid that nobody's ever heard of before, right? But it was the complete opposite of that. And so in light of that, I'm saying that for the context of, a lot of people have asked me, like, Luke, how do you grow so quick? Or Luke, how do you, do all this and whatever? And so I want to ask that to you, Preston. You've been in the space a lot longer than I have. You've seen a lot of names come and go. You've seen a lot of faces come and go. If someone out there is trying to start a business, or they're trying to get a connection with somebody in the Bitcoin space, or they're trying to have an impact, either like personally, like with their family and talking to their family, or they're trying to start like a educational business with Bitcoin, or they're trying to grow a following, or whatever they're trying to do, in your experience, having talked to so many people and seen both at the macro level and then the local level, what messages and storytellings work with people? Because I think that's what a lot of why my show did so well, was the storytelling. As you've seen all that, what would be your advice to people if they're trying to tell those stories and communicate an idea to others to have that go over successfully?
So a couple things. I would first, and this one isn't necessarily one I think people can work on. It's, you have to candidly, sincerely love the topic that you're covering. Like, you love this, Luke. Like, just like I love this. Like, I would be talking about this if it didn't pay me a cent, and I'd be talking about it for decades. And you know what? When we first started the show, that was the case for literally years. Like, literally years. We just would talk about, because we loved the topic. So that's the first thing that somebody has to, like, the gut check to themselves, is like, would I be talking about this for free? Or is there like some kind of hidden agenda, like that I want something out of this? Because if you're doing it to help other people learn, and you just genuinely love the topic, like, you're probably going to do really well, because it's not work. It's not work when you're treating it that way. The other thing that like, for you, like, you came on with that interview and you had all these graphical ways to back up what you were saying. And like, that's a lot of work. Like, it's a lot of work intellectually to get to the point where you can even make a slide deck like that, let alone the skill to go in and eloquently and simply describe it so that people can comprehend it and understand it. And that's another thing that, like, sometimes people just don't have that skill set. Like, I've worked around a lot of engineers in my life, and like some of them are brilliant, like brilliant people, but they would be literally the last person I would put in front of a room of 20 people to explain something to somebody. Some people have the innate talent for that, and you can overcome that, but you would have to work on that skill a lot before you just try to, like, I mean, you could do it simultaneously, but the problem you run into is if you were really bad at the beginning and then a couple of years later you got good, some of your old content would like kind of destroy your brand. And some of it is you have to do it a lot to get good at it. So like, I don't want to discourage somebody from starting out if they don't necessarily have that skill set, but you definitely have to kind of like hone that skill set. And the most important one of all is just sheer persistence. Like, I mean, persistence. If I knew what I know now about like how hard it is to kind of break through as like a person creating content in this particular domain from a media standpoint, and I knew like how just how much hard work is involved there, you might not ever start. And so the innocence of like not knowing that is probably a good thing. And it's just persistence. Like, it's a marathon. You are not running a sprint, you are running a marathon of marathons. And again, it goes back to like, if you truly, sincerely, candidly love what you're talking about, you can run that marathon. But if you hate running, like, sure, you can do the sprint, but you're definitely not going to run a marathon.
Yeah, for sure. And it's the same thing with Bitcoin. You know, Bitcoin, you were talking about the 4 years, like 4 years for a lot of people. I think a lot of people don't want to learn about Bitcoin because they don't even save money at all, right? Like, why would I save money for 4 years at all? And so I think it's the same way with Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin's not a sprint. You don't trade it like Preston did. Preston got lucky, right?
Oh God, that's it.
Yeah. You have it as a marathon. You know, and for those that are just starting that marathon, what do you think is a good target for them to start? Like, is it like, do you use a fiat number? Do you use a Bitcoin stacking target? Is it a percentage of savings, a percentage of income? Like, if you were to tell someone, hey, what's a good goal I should have for my first Bitcoin DCA, my first Bitcoin stacking target? How do you communicate that to them?
I think for people, like, they truly have to be reasonable with what their disposable income actually is.
Yeah.
Without changing their lifestyle so much. Like, oh well, I could save this amount. Let's say it's $500. I don't know. But like, let's just say, I could save $500. Well, they could barely even save $100 before they came to this understanding that they now want to own Bitcoin and that they're going to save $500. So like, for them, maybe that $400 difference is drastically changing their lifestyle and what they normally do. And so they're setting themselves up for a situation where it's like a diet, right? Like, people that go on like these like really hardcore diets, like it lasts 3 weeks and then they can't do it anymore because it changed their lifestyle so much that it was destined for failure at the start.
Yeah.
So people have to understand what their actual disposable income is. They have to be really reasonable with any type of change to what they think that is. And then they just have to realize that they're running a marathon and that they just dollar cost average and keep buying and not looking at it, just let it do its thing. And I think that's probably the best approach.
Well,
And
thank you, Preston, for your time. You've been very generous. Appreciate your insight. It's always amazing to pick your brain. Last question as we go. You have a lot of books behind you. What's the best one on there? What's the one I need to read?
That's hard for me to answer because it would come down to like the topic or what you're trying to really kind of, for Bitcoin, since that's what we were talking about, I would highly encourage people, and this might sound like a very cop-out answer, but Saifedean's book, The Bitcoin Standard, is exceptional. It's really good. Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, is exceptional. Phil Champagne's book, The Book of Satoshi, is exceptional. Those would be Bitcoin books for people, I think, starting out. From a finance, like general, like basic finance, like investing in stocks and stuff, there's a book called Margin of Safety by Seth Klarman. I think you're only going to be able to get it on a PDF download off the internet, because it's not for sale anymore, but it's free. I don't think he's a billionaire. I don't think he really cares. The people are just downloading it off the net. As far as like books that I think would just help people from like a success standpoint, like anything from Jim Rohn is wonderful. I was impacted a lot by like him, Tony Robbins, the books like Think and Grow Rich. I love that. I think it's a wonderful book by Napoleon Hill. People skills, like a book like How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think habits are an extremely important thing for people to focus on if they're trying to improve their success. So like the Power of Habits by Charles Duhigg, Atomic Habits by James Clear. Those are really, really, really good books. I like books on how the brain works. So like a book called The Brain is a really good one. There's another one by Stannis. Oh God, can't remember his last name. It's kind of hard to pronounce. Consciousness in the Brain, I think, is the name of that one. Yeah, it depends on the topic. It depends on the topics.
Yep. Well, thanks, Preston. Really appreciate it. People know where to find you. So
yeah, they know where to find you.
Yeah. They know where to find
Twitter.
You. Yeah. Where he'll make top and bottom predictions that you should not follow.
Exactly.
All right.
Dollar cost average.
Yeah, exactly. Fully agree. Well, Preston, thanks.
Thank you, Luke.
Yeah.